Hello, everyone. Welcome to Agitation Rising, your source for local leftist independent journalism in Central Illinois and beyond. My name is Zachary Gittrich, and today we are definitely going way beyond Central Illinois as we are going to be talking about the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. I have a very special guest here that I'm going to bring on. He is a political scientist, an activist, a journalist. He is not just any progressive American, not just a progressive American. He is the progressive American. And we are going to be discussing the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. We have some opposing ideas and beliefs on this, and we're going to try and work through these. So let me go ahead and bring him in.
Hello,
Mr. American. Is that how I should refer to you, Mr. American?
you can refer to me as Connor or whatever you like. It's fine. I really liked that little intro that I'm not just a progressive American, I'm the progressive American. I love that. Love
progressive
that.
American, yes. So everybody, if in the dictionary, if you look up progressive, you're going to see his face right next to it. So
yeah,
let's just get right on into this. Before we even get to the subject of Ukraine, I'd like for you as the progressive to define what progressivism means to you, because it's a term that throughout my life I have sometimes attributed to myself, but other times I'm not really sure what it means anymore. And a lot of times it's used to describe people that I would not consider progressive at all. And I'm more likely to refer to myself as like a socialist or a leftist. And obviously those terms are messy themselves. But so tell me, what define progressivism, and especially with regards to foreign policy, since that's our subject today.
Yeah, so there's a lot that can go into it. I mean, progressivism in 2024 is going to be very different from, say, progressivism in the 19th or 20th century. That's something that kind of has to be brought up because I also got my degree in history. So anytime I talk about a certain term, I kind of think about the context in which it exists. But for me, progressivism is upholding and maintaining the rights of everybody equally and ensuring that we all get basically a fair shake in the simplest of terms. Protecting the environment because it's what we only got this planet. Making sure that we're protecting women's bodily autonomy, ensuring disability rights are protected all across the board. Progressivism, as it stands in its relationship to government, is, for me, about protecting as many people as humanly possible, preserving the dignity of everybody as much as possible, and basically working towards democratizing society as much as possible. Dignity is really at the center of what I see as critical to progressivism, and that kind of goes into why I think it's so important for the United States to continue supporting Ukraine, because the dignity of millions of people and their lives are on the line. So that's kind of a general understanding of where I stand on progressivism and how I view it. I do kind of use the word progressive to describe myself just because I don't use the term leftist, just because of how fraught it's become, particularly online. Like, you'll see people who say, like, Hassan, for example, isn't a real leftist or whatever, or this person's not a real leftist or whatever. I'm just like, all right, fine. Civic progressive, social democrat, liberal kind of guy. That's kind of where I'm at. Just
So again, with regards to foreign policy, what does progressive ideology mean for foreign policy in your mind?
So in my mind, and this is why I made it specific about civic progressivism, one of the things I think is really important is upholding institutions that protect human dignity. We've unfortunately seen in the last decade a conservative reactionary shift on the international stage, abandoning human rights, abandoning the rule of law, ensuring, like, anti-genocide work is taken seriously. And in the case of Ukraine, we've seen consistent war crimes by the Russian government, to the point where Vladimir Putin has a warrant out for his arrest by the International Criminal Court. So from my perspective as a progressive, it would be immoral of me, and I'm not necessarily saying people who disagree with how we approach Ukraine are immoral, but it would be immoral to my standards of myself not to support Ukraine and its right to defend itself. And also, I think it also sets a standard for making sure authoritarians who don't care about human rights, who don't care about the well-being of their citizens, they only see them as useful to themselves, are able to just ramrod whatever they want at the expense of countless innocent people.
Where does the military-industrial complex fit into your understanding of progressivism?
It's a massive problem. Like, as much as I respect members of the military, I have family members who have served, who are serving. It is fundamentally a problem, and this is something I've had to tangle with quite a bit because, on the one hand, the military-industrial complex is one of the biggest problems in America. It's by far one of the most corrupting influences on our politics. It's heavily prevented us from being able to uh, look at, like, hey, can we spend money on helping our expand healthcare access, like putting money towards expanding healthcare access. The question always comes up, how are we going to pay for it? But nobody says the same thing for the military industrial complex. However, I also think that one of the things, at least in its relationship to Ukraine, is that we need to remember is that just as much as we should be concerned about the military industrial complex, we should also be concerned that human rights on the international stage get thrown under the bus. If we don't support Ukraine, we're going to have a larger situation where the international order that ensures or at least tries to ensure the well-being of people across the board is going to become increasingly weak, and it's just not going to be as effective. So, insofar as like the military-industrial complex being a problem as it relates to us providing aid, military, economic, humanitarian, whatever, uh, being a problem, I agree. It is a big problem, but not so much as the loss of human life that it continues to occur because of Russia's war of aggression.
Yeah, so let's get into that. You've written a couple articles. I mean, this is an issue that you focused on a lot on your channels and on your blog, and I'll include all these links in the description. So give us and take as much time as you need of the situation in Ukraine, what's going on there, and why, kind of the history that led up to it from your perspective, and why it's so important for progressives to continue to support this.
So, to be clear, I am not a foreign policy expert. I initially was not as aware of the history surrounding Ukraine, so I do want to make very clear I am not claiming to be an expert here. However, I was exposed to a bit of the history of Ukraine several years prior to the invasion in 2022 by a professor who I interviewed, and I think it was in the article I sent you, Dr. Christopher Budzitz from Loras College. And one of the things he made very, very clear is the autonomy of the Ukrainian people, that their ability to decide their own fate was central to any discussion. So that kind of was the framework that I started off with. Insofar as the history of the war, I can't obviously go back all the way to the Cossacks and the issues of like all their issues of linguistics, culture, and history in terms of like how they define themselves. But from basically the 90s onward, there was an ongoing conflict and tension with the creation of Ukraine as a state. Now, it's important to note, and I mentioned this in the article, Putin has repeatedly claimed that Ukraine is not a real country. His argument is that Ukraine was created as a socialist republic under the Soviet Union in the early 20th century, and the state of Ukraine really didn't get off until the 90s. But the identity and culture and the people trying to maintain themselves as a distinct entity, that has been a centuries long process. And there were several historians I linked to in that article that I wrote last night. Sorry again for that being late. It was quite a bit of reading to do. So there's themes of Ukrainian sovereignty that are really important. There are issues of what constitutes a true people that I think really goes at the heart of self-determination. That is especially important, and I think progressives really need to emphasize this point that self-determination for all people is a matter of human dignity. But to the actual history in the 90s, what basically ended up happening with the fall of the Soviet Union, I'm just going to keep this truncated because I can ramble. You basically started to see a complication between Ukraine and its relationship with both the former Soviet Union and the Russian Federation and the United States. And there was this serious tension of whether or not Ukraine was going to be a Western nation or a Russian affiliated nation. And Ukraine initially kind of had to deal with this tension. And honestly, it tried to stay neutral, which is why with the Budapest Memorandum, they actually ended up agreeing to remain a relatively neutral state. And they also handed over their nuclear materials to the Soviet Union, or the former Soviet Union, the Russian Federation, in exchange for Russia recognizing its sovereignty. Now, obviously, there's going to be a lot of problems with a relatively new nation state being built. Even if the people have a longstanding cultural, linguistic, and history, a state's still going to have problems. And one of the things that kind of came up was this same tension in leading up to 2013 and 2014. We saw a lot of pushes from the EU to start really trying to integrate it into trade agreements and things that would basically tie Ukraine much more to the West. And Russia was understandably firmly opposed to this, and they interfered multiple times through various alleged assassinations or just pressure on Ukraine to avoid it. And then Viktor Yanukovych, actually, who was the president at the time, basically undermined or sacked a deal that would have put Ukraine in a lot more basically strongly connect Ukraine to the European Union. This inevitably led to a massive amount of protest and riots, and Yanukovych's response was less than ideal. There was legislation that was passed that heavily restricted protest. There was open fighting in the streets, and in at least one instance, people were fired upon by their government and died. This inevitably also led to further violence and basically the overthrow of Yanukovych. He fled, and the legislature basically had to remove him because he wasn't in office. He was just gone. He left in the middle of the night. And from then on, Russia kind of has treated the government of Ukraine as if it's illegitimate. And in fact, one of the arguments that it has repeatedly used is that it is not the treaty that they signed, the Budapest Memorandum, does not apply because they're not dealing with the same government anymore. Never mind the fact that you don't sign treaties solely with like which president. They don't, just go out of nowhere. You sign it with countries. But since then, they basically seized territory in Crimea, Luhansk, and can't talk today. Donetsk and Luhansk, using Russian separatists, and basically they either were Russian military personnel that just had their uniforms removed to disguise themselves, but everybody knew they were speaking Russian, using Russian equipment, or they were directly funding or assisting separatists in direct violation of the Budapest Memorandum. As for 2022, it gets a little weird because, as I mentioned in my response to Eddie Lager-Smith of the Midwestern Marx Institute, and you saw that video, what we saw was an actual decline, according to the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner, in the overall casualties leading up in the eastern region, leading up to the invasion. So to some extent, it does kind of feel irrational, because it's something that, on its face, when they say there's a serious risk of genocide in that region, the actual casualty rates did not suggest that. And to me, it seems like this was much more of a naked power grab and something along the lines of Russia not necessarily wanting this old Soviet Union, as some people who are like more liberal like to say. It seems more like an appeal to the Russian imperial period, where they had this sphere of influence, and they seem to be seeing Ukraine as an extension of that. But it's very difficult to adequately say the motivations of a foreign leader, especially when they're lying a lot. So that's a rough version of what I've got, but there was a lot I had to go over as well. So
yeah, I mean, I feel one thing that seems to be missing is the fact that anywhere from 20 to 25% of Ukrainians are ethnically Russian, and they speak Russian, and they consider themselves in many ways Russian, even though they're in this country of Ukraine. And that for quite some time there has been enormous internal tension between the more ethnic Ukrainians in the West and the ethnic Russians in the East. And I feel like in so many of the conversations that I hear about this issue, the fact that there's this massive internal struggle going on, to the point that, I mean, it's easily argued that since 2014 there's been some kind of state of civil war going on.
Yeah.
but between these two sides within Ukraine, which yes, there's obviously foreign backing towards it, but that seems to be missing. The other issue is that you bring up the fact that of the president Yanukovych, who was elected, he was democratically elected in 2010, and he had a 5-year term, and he was overthrown in elections that were directly supported by the United States. You had Senator Chris Murphy, Senator John McCain, who never met a war or conflict that he didn't want to get involved with, that are physically there supporting these protesters. You have, Victoria Nuland, one of the most ghoulish neoconservatives that have ever been a part of our government. Directly, I mean, we have phone calls of her saying, we're trying to put these people in power. At this time, the Ukrainians could have, they did choose to put Yanukovych in power in 2010. He had 1 year left. They could have chosen the next year to replace him. And I feel that U.S. influence, NATO influence especially, which NATO is to me largely an extension of U.S. hegemony, was what actually led to this conflict reaching this level within Ukraine, not even talking about Russia's own problems with things like NATO, things like expansionism and stuff like that. But we're supposedly out here supporting democracy, and yet we're supporting, and yet we were meddling in this government when they had 1 year before another election, to the point where there was essentially a coup. And if you're an ethnic Russian in Ukrainian, some of these protests in 2014 are school children, massive amounts of school children shouting, "Hang the Russians, hang the Russians." That's what the ethnic Russians over in the East are hearing when they see these protests. And they see it with, yes, there are definitely fascistic elements in Ukrainian society. Now, I'm not going to try and pretend that, like, legitimize, like, Putin is like on some kind of denazification. I like that. That's just nonsense to me. And there's plenty of fascist elements over in the Russian side as well. But so much of this, despite the fact that we keep saying that we care so much about democracy and we want to protect democracy, and yet here we are interfering in this democracy. Our government, the state, violently put down Occupy protests just a year or two before this. So why was it legitimate when we did it, but it isn't legitimate when the Ukrainian president, the democratically elected Ukrainian president, is doing this?
So I would point out, like, in this case, I do not find it legitimate to react violently to political protests in the United States unless they're engaging in explicit, like, violence and harming people. So the first answer to your question is it's not legitimate. The state repeatedly violates the rights of protesters quite a bit. And also, in some cases, just as my experience as a political canvasser, you can kind of see the sign behind me from the Progressive Turnout Project. They also a lot of times they violate the rights of canvassers quite a bit, unfortunately. But I will say, insofar as the U.S. was involved, yes, we have Victoria Nuland on that phone call, but I would put this more in the category of us reacting to an ongoing thing that happened organically. Like you said, there was a lot of tension going on around ethnic issues. There were a lot of Russian-speaking people in the eastern region, but it's also worth noting that much of what they were calling for when they were going to have the vote that Russia required was initially to be more of a self-governing community within Ukraine, more decentralization, which caused a lot of confusion because if you read the full vote, like what the heck's the word, the tally, what they were saying is, would you be willing to support home rule or sovereign state rule? It was set in such a flawed way and vague way that people didn't really get a voice. So yes, I definitely think we do need to be aware of the ethnic tensions here, and also the violence and the far right elements in Ukraine. And I will not deny for a second that the U.S. has taken advantage of the situation. That much is obvious. But that doesn't justify, and I know you're not saying this, but I've had this argument before, the Russian government invading and basically saying that Ukraine is not a real country. Like I've mentioned this in the article I sent you, that Vladimir Putin wrote this extensive essay basically arguing that Ukrainian legitimacy is flawed, that it doesn't exist, that Ukraine does not have a right to exist as a country. And
Are you
so while
talking about
yes,
what he wrote? Are you talking about what he wrote in 2021?
yeah, I believe that. Yes, I think that's the correct one. He wrote a lot,
Yeah.
so and it's been a while.
I mean,
So
yeah, I read it last night. There were also major parts where he does say that he supports Ukraine as a country and its sovereignty in that. I don't have it right up in front of me, but you can go read it. And, again, I'm not going to trust any specific leader, but
no, but again,
I mean,
when you're
go
going
ahead.
into like saying things like their history when they were created, the Ukraine as an idea was created by the Soviet Union. Those specific statements, those are things that are meant to invalidate the identity, invalidate the country's ability to associate with who it wants to associate freely. And yes, the government, that interim government that came to power after the protests in 2014 were ridiculously corrupt, and there were far right elements in it. But since then, Zelensky was overwhelmingly elected by the people, and not 2 years later, literally 2 years later, there's plans for an invasion by Russia. So again, like there is this issue of legitimacy of Ukrainian determination. Like we're talking about this in the context of America, Russia, and then Ukraine. But the reality is the Ukrainians very rarely get to be talked about in their own right. And that's why I'm heavily emphasizing this. Yes, the United States will always look after its self-interest. It doesn't do things purely out of the goodness of its heart. I don't think anybody who is on my side of this issue is under any illusion on that. It's painfully obvious. But the cost to the Ukrainian people and to the long-term stability of Europe and really the world is at stake here. This is the largest military conflict in Europe since World War II. So U.S. involvement, yes, it was heavily involved. But again, Russia was the one that chose to escalate in 2022. Things were calming down. Russia was the one that could have gone through negotiations when they had issues with the interim government. The Budapest Memorandum provides for meetings and consultations and mechanisms to communicate diplomatically. It chose
They
not to.
did. It was called the Minsk Accords in 2014 and 2015.
And then they violated them immediately. Nobody was serious about the Minsk Accords. It was a formal way to say, hey, yeah, we're seeking peace. And then they went immediately back to fighting. I mean,
We've had public statements, because there were four main countries involved in the Minsk Accord negotiations: the French president Hollande, German Merkel, and then Poroshenko, who replaced Yanukovych after the 2014 coup. Every single one of those three have explicitly admitted that this was merely a pause to bring up Ukraine's military, that this was not meant for them to ever be a lasting peace in any way. I do think that Putin did want this to be more of a lasting thing, and he did want to see this de-escalate, only for all three of these leaders that he was negotiating with to explicitly come out and say, yeah, we were never serious about this in the first place.
Well, see, that's where I disagree. And this is where I think the issue of legitimacy comes in. Russia actively, its first response to this government wasn't to seek out an internationally observed referendum. It was to send, supporters and separatists to seize government buildings and territory. That was the condition for when these votes were taken. So if you're Ukraine and you see, oh, we signed this agreement, we gave up our nukes, which we could get into the serious risk of nuclear proliferation that comes with the situation here. But, if you're Ukraine and you just realize, hey, my borders were just violated and a bunch of my citizens had to flee. And also now there's this vote that doesn't have like neutral international observers overseeing it. I mean, from that perspective, it's not just like, and when I say they violated, I meant both sides violated it. It wasn't going to be a serious thing. But again, the Budapest Memorandum provided a mechanism. Russia actively sought to seize territory, and they used a front to do it. So from Ukraine's perspective, these guys can't even be honest with me about like from Ukraine's
At,
perspective,
at which
it's
time period? Because we're talking about a
2014.
lot of different time periods. It
Yeah,
was
we're
2014.
mixing some stuff. Yeah, we're specifically talking about Luhansk, Donetsk, and Crimea. So when they start seizing all that territory right in 2014. So again, like if you're a country and you just got started and now you've had this majorly destabilizing event, that the overthrow of Yanukovych, and then instead of the country that previously occupied you in a massive union, I won't say empire because I don't think it's a strictly that. But this massive union that has a sordid history, and suddenly you have people who are very clearly speaking Russian, they're using Russian equipment, they're in your borders, and they didn't even try to negotiate a mechanism for a peaceful you know like secession. Like if they wanted to say, hey, these people want to be their own country, we need international observers to come in, that would be different, but they didn't do that. And that's where I think this, from the Ukrainian perspective, as far as I can see it, I'm not obviously representative of them, it really does go to, hey, these guys are going to operate in bad faith anyway, I need to prepare in case they decide to take more territory. So that's where I don't buy into this idea that the Ukrainians or the Western allies were somehow the only ones interested in just throwing Minsk to the side. This was a serious issue where their territorial integrity was violated, and they didn't trust the Russians to uphold their end of the deal. And maybe that creates a self-fulfilling prophecy, but this started when Russia seized Ukrainian territory illegally.
So I'll just start out by saying that I don't think Russia invading Ukraine let me see, it was February 24th, 2022. I don't believe that was justified.
I know.
But I do believe that there was massive provocation going back decades that led to this. It's interesting. I was actually just watching an interview with Norman Finkelstein, who I respect a lot, even though I disagree with him, where he actually says that he kind of argues differently, that it was actually, there was a justification because there had been so much provocation. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. But that's kind of my position specifically on the war, because I'm not here trying to defend Russia or Putin or anything like that. I guess the question that I have as somebody, real quick, how old are you?
25.
25. So as somebody that grew up, both of you and I have grown up in the United States. We've always been at war.
Yeah.
And I grew up, I witnessed 9/11 happen. I was at home. I saw the planes fly in, and I saw the reaction to it, and I saw us going into the Iraq war, and I saw us getting more, these constant conflicts, and I saw how devastating they all were. And so when I see us getting involved in this conflict, this internal conflict that's in Ukraine and that's in Russia's regional sphere of influence. It's not within our regional sphere of influence. I mean, this is a country on the other side of the world. I'm wondering, like, why is it necessary that we as Americans are involved in this in the first place? Because all I see is us escalating this.
So I think there's a couple things here. Anytime some sort of military conflict occurs, or any real conflict, there is a limitation to human agency. I want to make this point very clear, because a lot of times when I have this conversation with people, they're like, well, where's the war end? Where's the war end? And the truth is, I don't know. I don't think anybody 100% knows in this situation. And we should be trying to seek a just and diplomatic peace if it guarantees the sovereignty of Ukraine. But to your question about why America specifically, America's the one who was one of the countries that convinced Ukraine to give up its nuclear material in the first place. And this is another thing, and I wish I had hit on this in the article, but I was writing it up within like a couple hours, and I had to go out. I was just sick of being on the computer and in the house all day. But there's a serious risk that what's happening in Ukraine right now and what's happened since 2014 basically sends the message that non-proliferation treaties don't matter. They're actually not in your interest. Russia hasn't just invaded Ukraine; they've also invaded Georgia. They've occupied territory in Moldova. And whether or not you think those positions were justified, or if Russia had a
But what
serious
were those
claim
in
there,
response to? What were those in
there
response
was
to?
political violence. Yeah, massive political and ethnic violence. But I would also
Yeah,
point out that
those were in
Russia,
response to NATO expansion, which I know that you're skeptical of this narrative, but those were directly in response to decades of NATO expansion.
how would you say that? Because from my perspective, that would incentivize NATO expansion, because other countries who have seen Russia take territory would flee to NATO's protection to try and ensure that it doesn't happen to them.
So, I guess real quick, I'll answer that question real quick. I want to know what do you believe NATO's purpose is post Soviet Union? Because now we're getting into kind of the NATO part of this.
Yeah. So initially, I would argue that it largely has been a defensive alliance, primarily aimed at ensuring no further Russian aggression. I won't deny that it is antagonistic to Russia, but I would also point out that it exists in the context of Russia previously taking large swaths of territory. I mean, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was a big deal for people all over through Eastern Europe, because they saw Poland get swallowed. And that's part of the reason, even with the nominally left-wing government in Poland, they're antagonistic to Russia. Not just because they're in NATO, but because Russia has previously occupied them and held their territory, and they were denied the right to have a state of their own. I mean, if we want to, I'm not a big scholar of Soviet history, but I mean that is a big deal, and that is going to send people with the understand to NATO with the understanding that, hey, this is our only option to avoid Russia getting involved. And that's kind of
But,
where America kind of gets involved in.
but
It's
that's
NATO.
why I specifically asked post Soviet Union. Because if you want to go back that far, Russia can also say, hey, the two biggest times that we were attacked, with Napoleon in 19th century
Yeah,
and then Hitler, guess where they were coming from? They were coming through Ukraine. So yeah,
but
we have a lot of
I'm more
personal
specifically
animosity
talking.
towards this too. So what about, like, to me, it seems that NATO, as a defensive pact against communism and against Soviet Union, its purpose ceases to exist
No,
after
so
the Soviet Union collapses.
I don't want to interrupt. I just want to clarify what I was saying there. I'm talking about that as a legacy and on the minds of Eastern European countries who have had to deal with Russia. So that's why I'm saying the legacy and the role of NATO at that point shifts from, hey, we're trying to contain the Soviet Union, to, oh shit, if we don't do something to ensure that Russia doesn't invade us, or tries to reinforce its influence over us as sovereign states, we're going to be screwed. So that's where I'm saying that's the role of NATO. Now, I would say it was, to some extent, yes, its influence was no, it was kind of carefree, and it wasn't as clear in its mission, but it has been, heavily influential and important, especially when you consider that a lot of these countries didn't really get the guarantee that Ukraine did, and Russia again violated it. So again, like this NATO expansion, it plays a role, but the reason it expanded in the first place was the legacy of those occupations. And that's where it worries me that, as much as I was, like, prior to the war in Ukraine, I was very much of the opinion, a very similar opinion, that NATO was irrelevant. Why are we having this thing? Right? We have an issue with them Russians in Syria, but we probably shouldn't even be in Syria, but or whatever. Like, but as things
It
changed,
was also largely caused by us too.
yeah. So, like, it was, my opinion on that has significantly shifted just seeing the cost of this invasion. You said that I wrote quite a bit about Ukraine. I had to stop. I had to stop just because I couldn't get the images of all the blood and death out of my head. Like, there were 3 straight days when the war started where I literally just could not sleep or eat. It was terrible. So there is a part of me that had a massive shift in how I think about this and how I look at NATO. Because, yeah, maybe it was irrelevant for a while, but not to the people who needed to be protected and ran to it for security. And then this is why I heavily emphasize that it is important to not just look at this as a conflict between the United States and Russia, but of the people of Ukraine and the people of Eastern Europe who have to worry about Russia's influence over their lives. For us, it's just a discussion. For them, it's life or death.
So Soviet Union collapses. 1999, NATO adds Czechia, Hungary, and Poland to NATO. Russia doesn't invade any other countries or anything because of that. 2004, it adds Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia, 3 of which are right on Russia's borders. And it still doesn't start invading any other countries. It wasn't until 2008 when we're like, yeah, we're going to add Ukraine and Georgia that Russia finally actually responds and occupies Georgia, which again, I'm not saying it was legitimate under international law to do that, but I don't think that it was an irrational response for them to do that. So I don't know if I necessarily buy this argument that all these countries are joining NATO because they're in fear of Russia, when Russia waited, I don't know, almost a decade and a half before it actually started invading other countries in response to NATO expansion.
Well, I mean, if they were able to wait that long and see, like, if they're waiting all that time and see NATO expanding and again not getting into any military conflict with the United States, at least not directly, or NATO directly, I don't think it's necessary. I mean, like, here's the other thing. Like, we have had difficulty with Cuba in the past, and we had the Cuban Missile Crisis. We were overtly aggressive in that case. But since then, we haven't really had a full-on, let's go and invade Cuba moment since that point. It's just because there's a potential source of tension does not necessarily mean that a military intervention is necessary.
We've just had them under embargo for 60 years, and we tried 700 assassinations against Fidel Castro. I mean,
no, I know, but I'm talking.
We've had the Monroe Doctrine in the United States that says if you come over here and mess with us, we're not going to take that. But Russia sees increasing military expansion on its borders, and we expect them to have no reaction. It's almost as if we're saying, Russia, you're really selfish for putting your country right next to all of our military bases. What were you thinking?
No, again, like this is again, it's the legacy of that. Why would those countries join in the first place? Russia, for the longest time, had one of the largest countries, like organizations, or I don't even know how to describe it, unions in the world. It was insane
because there's economic and military benefits to it.
Yeah, there are
joining NATO.
Yeah, but the other thing is, even with, like, first off, NATO was controversial in Ukraine long before, like, 2014 and 2022. So I sincerely doubt that they would have joined. Like, there were some polls that were conducted, and this is based off of memory, so I'm not going to give an exact statistic because I can't remember. But it was pretty evenly split about whether or not they even wanted to join NATO in the first place. So the likelihood that Ukraine would join NATO is at best sketchy, just because it has had such a corruption problem. It's controversial now, especially, but even before, like, the invasion, it was pretty controversial to join NATO. So from my perspective, no, it wasn't necessary for them to invade Georgia or to intervene in Moldova. These alliances,
I'm not saying it's necessary. I'm saying it's a rational response.
Okay, but rational doesn't necessarily mean justified, is what I'm trying to say.
I'm not saying it's justified either.
I know that.
It's a rational response, and it's the exact same thing that we would do if we started seeing people encircling us over in our sphere of influence. And it comes off as massive. It comes off as this massive double standard. And the fact of the matter is, the Russian Federation is not the Soviet Union. It is not a world power. It is a regional power at best. Yes, they're a nuclear world power, but in every other way, they are at best a regional power.
So if they're a regional power, why do they get to have a sphere of influence over other countries? Because that, to me, this idea of this is,
no, but in their region, in 2004, 3 countries right on their border joined NATO and put military bases. That's their sphere of influence. Canada is in our sphere of influence. Mexico is in our sphere of influence.
But that doesn't mean we get to influence them. Like, you objected to what we're doing in Cuba, which I agree with. That is completely and utterly unacceptable. But that doesn't mean Russia gets to do the same. I am not denying for a second that the United States has played a major role in escalating this. My problem is now that we are at this point, we can't just let Russia continue to try and undermine Ukrainian sovereignty. Because again, this idea that NATO started it is a convenient justification for a nation state that is writing constantly about how the Ukrainian country was created by the Soviets. So I keep going back to that because that legacy plays a heavy role in the Eastern European mind. Like it's like this is why I get we're going to go back and forth on this all day. And apologies if I get a little testy. I'm not feeling too well today. But this I think the back and forth about whether or not NATO started it or the fear of Russia's influence in the past contributed to people joining NATO. Ultimately, it is going to be the fear. I mean, it goes like for Poland as an example. They have consistently warned about them being next. This isn't just something where it's like, oh, it's the United States and NATO expansion. NATO expanded because there is legitimate fear there. There is that history. And just to make this point, I don't think the United States continued policy in the Monroe Doctrine. I don't think it's as effective as it should be in terms of keeping people safe. I think it legitimizes this very argument that Russia is making, that it has had to react to NATO aggression. So I would say if we were to be handling Cuba, it would be much more diplomatic, much more open to working with them because it sets the standard on the international stage that we won't engage in this kind of argument that it's rational, and we're just going to abuse other people's things here. So like what America does on the world stage and how it has treated other countries, I definitely think we should change that policy because it creates this kind of environment. It does create a justification. But at the same time, so long as we use the sins of our country as a justification to either ignore or fail to react to other countries' actions like Russia's aggression, we're going to see more of this. This isn't just like, this is where I get really, really frustrated because I hear people all the time talking about how we need to seek a peace deal and America's in the way. And what they won't mention is how Russia demanded it would have the right to veto any request for military assistance for Ukraine from outside countries if they got attacked again. That's why the deals keep falling through, because Russia keeps assuming it has authority over Ukraine, that it has the right, that because they're next to Ukraine, they can somehow dictate every single thing about their security. It's not the sphere of influence does not mean you get to coerce your neighbor. America does it, and it's wrong, and it should not be continuing. But one sin does not mean it should continue.
Ignore your neighbor. Like, we're not solipsists here. I understand that there's this argument. Well, Ukraine's sovereign and they can do whatever they want. They can do whatever you're right. They can do whatever they want. But if you ignore how that's going to affect other countries, then yeah, you're going to run into problems. I'm not denying that because of historical reasons, a lot of these other countries had, fears, whether they're rational or irrational, of Russia. But what I'm not hearing is you also acknowledging that Russia, which since the post-World War II saw NATO as an existential threat throughout the entire Soviet Union, and then they see it continue after this. I don't hear you acknowledging that they have a legitimate reason to fear this at the same time. And again, Poland says it's afraid of Russia. It joined in 1999. There was no Russian aggression. Russia at that point is reeling from shock doctrine. They're in basically like utter economic collapse because of the neoliberal takeover that we did, and Putin suddenly coming to power and trying to like get the pieces up right around then. But Poland wasn't in any existential danger in 1999 when it joined NATO.
But that was a long and extended process. Yes, it was much later, but again, this is not just something like, oh, we can say, oh, Russia's going to invade immediately. It's the legacy. That's why I keep bringing up the legacy thing. How other countries perceive how they've been treated in the past can and will heavily influence how they perceive their future. And yeah, sure, Russia can say we're afraid of NATO, but for all intents and purposes, NATO wasn't going to do anything. And as you said yourself, it was largely irrelevant. Prior to this invasion, people were openly questioning whether or not NATO would even matter anymore. I mean, that's the thing that drives me nuts here. We can point to NATO expansion, but realistically, NATO wasn't going to do anything because it was just really at that point a stamp saying, "Hey, you're not gonna. We've got an alliance now." Now it's actively reacting and seriously considering what it's going to be like under the upcoming administration, and how it's going to have to function on its own. So I get that
And
from the
we could
Russian.
talk about that with Trump. I'd be interested to talk about that real quick. NATO's a defensive agreement, right? It's
Yes.
not meant to be an offensive agreement.
Yeah, right. And that's the other thing I was trying to say. Also, I get a little distracted because they're arguing. They're not arguing. They're yelling about the Bears game. I'm guessing they're blowing it like they did with the Commanders game. But yeah,
Well,
like,
so I mean, here's NATO, a defense agreement, attacks Bosnia in 92 to 95. Bosnia is not a part of NATO. Bosnia wasn't attacking any NATO members. It attacks Yugoslavia in 1999. Yugoslavia is not a part of NATO. It wasn't attacking any NATO members.
Yugoslavia was the one where there was the genocide that was going on, if I remember correctly.
Yeah,
right?
but
Or is that
that does not trigger Article 5 of NATO,
No.
which article, for people who don't know, Article 5 is basically if you attack a NATO country, all the NATO countries are going to come together and beat you. The only time that Article 5 was ever done was Afghanistan in 2001,
9/11.
where we were legitimately we were attacked.
Yeah.
And 20 years later, we saw how successful that reaction was. Trillions of dollars lost. NATO had limited, not necessarily troops on the ground, but limited involvement in Iraq in 2004. It had direct involvement in Libya in 2011. So if you're Russia, where are you seeing this as, purely a defensive, just trying to protect its own people, as opposed to it's not only expanding, it's attacking countries that have never attacked any NATO country? I mean,
Okay, so
what is your reaction to, say, for instance, the 2011 war in Libya?
well, I was going to get into that, or I was going to get into
Gaddafi.
Yugoslavia. I would say in the case of Yugoslavia, I think the evidence is pretty clear, and I was trying to remember off the top of my head. But yeah, like in the case of Yugoslavia, that's they're dealing with genocide, and the UN wasn't doing anything. So in that case, unless you're trying to commit genocide in that particular case, and then I'll get to Libya. Libya is a lot more messy. The overwhelming reality in that case was, hey, there's an ongoing genocide. The international institutions aren't doing anything. And who's in the best position to stop it? NATO. And so, yeah, I could understand if like Russia was in the process of committing genocide and they were, then they'd have a legitimate fear in that case. But no, like they weren't. So there isn't really this thing like, hey, you bombed Yugoslavia. That one, I don't, I'm kind of reticent to put that into a justification for Russian aggression or concern. Bosnia, I'm not super familiar with that conflict, so I'm not going to try and like spread any misinformation or anything on that. So I'm just not going to comment, just because
I'm not necessarily trying to like argue like there was a genocide there, we shouldn't have done anything. I'm not arguing justification. I'm just saying,
I know
this defensive organization is explicitly doing certain actions.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
it's behaving in an aggressive and expansionist way. But you wanted to touch on Libya, because I asked you about Libya.
I have a bit of an understanding, but I was pretty young when Libya happened. So it was.
I was in college when it happened.
Yeah.
And I have some shameful beliefs about it that I completely.
Oh, do tell! Now I gotta know that one. Oh
man, back in 2011, I was freshly in college. I was all into the hope and change stuff of Obama. I think I remember sending an email to the White House being like, I don't want boots on the ground, but go ahead and put a no-fly zone. And trust me, these are shameful beliefs that I no longer hold anymore.
Yeah, no, and I wouldn't necessarily say I was a Republican at the time, because I just grew up in the northern suburbs of Illinois, white dude.
You were best friends with Kevin Ferris.
I
So
was not
you know,
best friends with Kevin
that
Ferris. Don't try
probably
to
had
pull that on
some
me.
influence.
We were in Boy Scouts together, and
That's
we'll
Boy
have to get
Scout
to
thing.
that. And then, yeah, no, jeez, trying to throw me off on that, but okay. But no,
Sorry,
like,
okay, sorry. Go ahead,
yeah,
Libya.
you're good. You're good. That I was waiting for the comment about Libya, and then we got into Kevin Ferris. If Kevin, if you see this, I'm not sure if I'll do another response video to you yet, but chances are you'll feature on an article or two. Jeez. So, but yeah, no, I'm just like, my understanding is there was a UN resolution involving some of the humanitarian problems there, and unfortunately, one of the things that has really frustrated me and a lot of people is that the UN is really toothless on a lot of things. It'll pass a lot of legislation, resolutions, and sometimes it won't even pass the things that it needs to do to uphold human rights. And then it won't have an enforcement mechanism. So I don't necessarily look at Libya and Yugoslavia in the same way as, say, a blatant war of aggression. And I think this is more in the context of a military alliance that is, in theory, defensive, reacting to a failure of the United Nations. I don't think, however, that means that it's suddenly going to invade Russia or that it's under any particular threat from that alliance. And again, like, I believe it was the French president, was it Emmanuel Macron, who was publicly saying, like, before the invasion, that, we were having questions about why the hell we even have NATO. And so this is where I get into the framework where I look at, and again, I know you're not justifying it. I know you're not in the category of people who are just cheering on Russia and not parroting that. I'm just making this point in terms of what standard we're setting when we react to these kinds of things. I look at it very much of, if international institutions upheld and enforced human rights more consistently, I think the interventions in these cases probably wouldn't have occurred, or at least not to the same degree that they did. But again, that's a hypothetical. We don't really know for certain.
So real quick, do you think that we should, because we did, but we should have gotten involved in Libya in
No,
2011?
I think the United States handled that very poorly. I'm just explaining the context of why these things. I think these things occurred. Yugoslavia, that one I think is a little more is pretty understandable. Genocide's a pretty big problem. But in the case of Libya, the end result was catastrophic. I don't think there was a serious consideration, or at least as serious enough consideration, as to the consequences in destabilizing Libya. And we've seen, the open slave markets and things like that that have played a
Slavery was
major.
brought back to Libya. I mean, it's
Yeah,
insane.
it was like, so yes, and this is where I heavily emphasize, on a completely other note, the importance of a stronger United Nations, where these conflicts can not only be prevented, but also an agreement can be made for a long-term peace. The problem, I think, what we've seen is we have countries, including the United States, and this is kind of me going off on a tangent, so feel free to stop me, and Russia and China, who view these institutions not so much as mechanisms to seek peace, but as a mechanism to expand their influence. And unfortunately, uh, that seems to have been like in Libya, that seems to have been basically the hole that we filled, and we shouldn't have. So that's my little rant there, but yeah.
So I want to read off something from Bill Burns, who I believe is the current CIA director. He was the ambassador to Russia from 2005 2008, and he sent a memorandum to Condoleezza Rice,
Yes.
where, and I believe this is a direct quote, and I'll make sure I put it in the description. NATO enlargement, particularly in Ukraine, remains an emotional and neuralgic issue for Russia. Russia would view further eastward expansion as a potential military threat. In Ukraine, these include fears that the issue could potentially split the country into, leading to violence or even, some claim, civil war, which would force Russia to decide whether to intervene. I don't know what else to, and I guess here I'll get more into my ideology of why I find the NATO expansionist argument so convincing as to why Russia has behaved in this way, and especially in relation to Ukraine. I am a very cynical, disaffected millennial going through the aftermath of 9/11, the war on terror, the Patriot Act, the Iraq War, the Libya War, the 7 wars that we were in under Obama. And it is my strong belief that most military conflicts, especially the ones that the United States is involved in, are at the very least significantly influenced, if not directly caused by the military industrial complex. We have a war economy. We
Yes.
want to go around and create as many wars as possible, because then you can sell more weapons, and you can sell exactly like that. And that's what I see as the trajectory post a Soviet Union of NATO, as just a way to fuel the military industrial conflict, not conflict, but the military industrial complex, which I do not view as valuable. As somebody who could be a progressive or a leftist, I do not view the military industrial complex as valuable or beneficial to us. And so to me, it just, knowing the history of the military industrial conflict, going over how NATO is engaging in offensive things despite allegedly being a defensive pact, despite allegedly only being there to fight the Soviet Union, and the cynic in me is saying, look, all these politicians, I mean, to me, this is in itself a part of the very neocon ideology that we lambasted in 2000s, and we called all these neocons the worst people alive. And it seems to me that Biden was a neocon, Hillary Clinton was a neocon. A lot of these people that are part of his administration that are pushing for continuing involvement in Ukraine are all neocons. I don't see how this is different than a lot of those other conflicts, except for minor details here and there, that they were able to get Russia to strike first, and so it comes off as them not being legitimate, when in Iraq we struck first, even though they were no threat to us. Same thing in Libya, and all of these things. And so I don't
Dick
know
Cheney
why
and those guys should have been at the Hague. I'm just going to be very clear. Like Dick Cheney, George W. Bush, those guys should have been sent to the Hague. That whole
yeah,
war
but I'm at the point
mistake.
where I'm going to put Biden there too. He voted for Iraq. He supported all of these different neocon inventions. He is a neoconservative.
Yeah, and
exactly
again, I'm not
he
here
is.
to like worship at the boots of Joe Biden. I met him once, and then I helped
He
knock
probably
him
doesn't
out of the
remember
Iowa
it.
caucus. He was a lot more energetic and aware when I met him. He actually had a pretty good handshake. I don't think he would have that now. But
It depends on the
I
pills
think,
he's on, man.
yeah, well, assuming whatever he's got going on. But to your point about NATO in Ukraine, yeah, Russia probably was worried because of the ethnic tensions there. But again, Ukraine wasn't going to join NATO. It requires all of these countries to unanimously agree. And Ukraine had a massive corruption problem. That's part of the reason it was having some of these tensions in the first place. Yes, the ethnic tensions were very real, but it also had the serious issues in services, people making all these backdoor deals. That's part of the reason Zelensky was elected by such a large margin. So I sincerely doubt that the United States or most of the NATO countries would want Ukraine in NATO prior to the invasion in 2022. So yes, were there
They've
concerns?
been saying it
And
since
yeah,
2008. What are you talking about? They've
they
been
were
saying it
talking
since
about it, but
2008.
again, but
They were talking about it. That's the whole thing. If you hear
okay,
someone
because the
talking
United
about
States
something,
was
you don't
talking about
wait.
it doesn't mean other countries would agree. That's the thing. This is again, like you just put out an official saying, hey guys, it's a bad idea for Ukraine to join NATO, and it wasn't even put forward in terms of any official process. There was a peace agreement that was made in the early 90s, but it's been back and forth with Ukrainians themselves being hesitant to do it because of the very thing you talked about. So I
So
don't.
why not just us as effectively the leaders of NATO? The U.S. is the
The
overwhelming
financial
dominant
one, yeah.
force. Yeah. Why not just say, okay, You want to know what, Russia? We're not going to involve. We're not going to do it. Ukraine, instead of constantly saying, nope, they have the right to do it. Here's the olive branch, and then at the same time, funneling weapons to them. We've been funneling weapons to them for like a decade. And
Yeah,
by the way,
and
Obama didn't want to. Obama was like, hey, man, I don't see what the point. I don't see why we need to be involved in this country that is one of the most corrupt countries in Europe, that we have almost no economic relationship whatsoever. And it was Trump who started sending weapons back to Ukraine, which is exactly what the neocons wanted.
Yeah, and again, I just want to be very, very clear. When I say Ukraine wasn't going to join NATO, I think the corruption was what was preventing it. As to us sending weapons, in my opinion, that was the dumbest thing they could have possibly done. I mean, yes, at this point, it looks like, hey, Ukraine is probably not going to join NATO, but America keeps making statements.
Would
The
you
issue, I
support them
think,
joining
is
NATO?
yeah, well, I'm sorry.
Would you support Ukraine joining NATO?
Not right now. Definitely not right now. Especially with how much things are just going crazy. Like if Ukraine was to join NATO, and to clarify, you're asking if I wanted Ukraine to join NATO right now.
Yeah, right now.
Right now, we'd have to invoke Article 5. It would be a nuclear war. Yeah, there's just no way. And even then, like, let's say the war stops today. Let's say the war stops today, and we start rebuilding Ukraine. There's more humanitarian aid, which is one of the things I really want to emphasize. A lot of our stuff's military aid. We need to do more humanitarian aid. It's way too little humanitarian aid. It's like, I think it was like 2.3 billion. Actually, I have it right here. Hold on, sorry, my thing right here. Yeah, it's 2.8 billion.
I do have. I don't mean to interrupt you. I do have this as one of the questions, because I'll definitely circle back to the breakdown of the aid and my opinions on it. What I'm trying to understand, and this is where, one of these areas,
we're disagreeing. It's fine.
What are the material benefits for Americans to be involved in this, to Americans directly?
Well, for one, I would just say it's kind of hard to say like, oh, these guns are going to Ukraine and Americans at home are going to directly benefit right now. I think this is a long-term thing where we're trying to make sure a major country in Europe stays stable and is able to continue to exist, because if Russia continues to attack other countries because it thinks it can, or because it thinks it's in its legitimate interest to do so to prevent them from, say, joining NATO, as we've been going back and forth on, I think that creates an environment where more and more countries pursue nuclear weapons to keep Russia away. And that this is something I wanted to get into earlier. The fact that Ukraine promised not to have nuclear weapons and they didn't, and all they got really was a war, that sends a message to a lot of other countries that, hey, we got to make a rush for the bomb. And I worry for Americans, we may not live in Europe, but we still suffer the consequences of a long-term like nuclear proliferation buildup. We've already seen things get more and more violent across the planet, whether it's the ongoing unbelievable brutality of the Israeli government against Palestinian civilians, whether it's the risk of China invading Taiwan and also having conflicts with its neighbor India, and all these territorial disputes. And when you add nuclear proliferation into the mix, there's a serious risk to American life. So sending a message to the world that, hey, we are going to back you up if a country goes after you like this, I think it tones down this concern a little bit that, hey, there is somebody that can back us up. We don't have to make a rush for the bomb. If America just decides, all right, we're done, we're not going to support you anymore, there's a hole that needs to be filled. There's going to be a power vacuum. And a lot of these European powers are going to rush into the most aggressive way that they can to fill that hole. And that makes us less safe. It makes the world more unstable. And God forbid another even worse military conflict comes about. So it's not going to be like your meat and potatoes benefits, but it is a safety issue. I mean, Americans are less safe when there's more nukes.
So I agree with you. I am very concerned with nuclear proliferation, but I think that the country that is most likely spreading interest in nuclear proliferation is the United States. Right? Iraq gave up its nuclear program and we invaded them, and there's video of us hanging Saddam Hussein.
Yes.
Libya gave up its nuclear program and he was anally raped with a metal pole by a random mob. We
I'm gonna have to
had
censor that one on my end. So
that's fine, but like that's the reality of what happened. And
yes,
so you see Iran, you see North Korea, they're like, no, we're not going to end up like that. We had a deal in place again under
yes,
Obama to actually that would have largely prevented Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. And I even think that there's originally they didn't want a nuclear weapon. I think originally they just wanted nuclear power. And I think part of that's propaganda, but that's for another argument. And Trump got us out of it, and Biden did not get us back in
yeah.
to that Iran nuclear deal.
That was a massive
Well, I
mistake.
see us, the United States and NATO, as the biggest causes of countries being like, screw this, we need a nuclear weapon, so that the US and NATO doesn't come after us.
And again, like I would argue the United States, less so NATO. I think NATO is again, prior to 2022, it was there was a big question about whether or not it needed to exist, especially because Trump was talking about pulling out of it during his presidency.
Even though he added 2 countries during his
Yes,
presidency.
yes. Which is
So,
that's the thing where I'm like, people were openly questioning why it existed. What point was it doing? I'm not super of the opinion that like NATO was the one that's contributing the most. The United States was, but that goes to my point though. In the case of an absence of a counterbalance to Russia's aggression, you'll have the same effect. And that's where it's like, you can point to the United States and say, hey, they're contributing to nuclear proliferation. I agree with you. But so is Russia. And without a counterbalance, some sort of counterbalance that prevents this kind of aggression to other countries, they're going to go for the bomb.
but it's not symmetric. These are not equivalent concerns for the world. It is not a symmetric. The overwhelming majority of concerns are because of American imperialism. Would you agree that the military-industrial complex is a huge reason that NATO still exists?
Oh yeah, I would definitely agree with that. But
would you agree
again,
that the military-industrial complex's reason for existence is to engage in military conflicts? That it actively seeks out military conflicts?
I would say it definitely exists to maintain military conflicts, and that's part of the reason it's something I've tangled with on this issue quite a bit. But no, I just again, like, this is, whether or not it is symmetrical does not change. It is still relevant. And again, like, this we're talking heavily about like the United States and its influence, but what doesn't get talked about a lot is the humanitarian cost to the Ukrainians, and who have, even if you were to say like that they wanted, in the eastern section, wanted to be separated from the government in Kiev, that could have been handled a completely different way. Again, the choice, whether you think it's rational or not, was an escalation. And that sends a message. So, like, yeah, America's been heavily involved in Iraq, in Libya, and Afghanistan. And I would say
Syria,
Afghanistan's a little more.
Pakistan,
Yeah. I
Pakistan,
mean,
in
yeah,
Somalia, in Sudan, in
yeah,
Haiti, in
yes.
Venezuela.
Ongoing. Yeah, it's an ongoing problem. But again, if America's influence on that level can scare countries into seeking nukes, so too can Russia, because they have a military that is able to wage a war for the last 2 to 3 years. So again, it doesn't really matter if it's symmetrical if the end result is the same. If we're still having nuclear proliferation without a counterbalance or something to send the message that this is not going to continue, that these kinds of acts will not be tolerated, or some sort of institution, if there's some other institution besides the United States or NATO blocking this, fine. Yeah, I'd say, okay, cool. Now the United States needs to start controlling its behavior, and it should have been as it should have been doing for the last 40 years. But that does not change. But we don't have that. And that's where I have this big problem, where it's like, we don't want to let this military industrial complex run rampant, but we also have to remember that these other countries have to worry about their security and their existence. And the only one that seems to be in any position to adequately provision this defense is the United States. And that's just it. It's
You mentioned the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. I completely agree. I mean, I think it's horrible. Um, the majority of the money that we're giving them is military, which I am opposed to. I have no problem sending humanitarian aid. It is my belief that Russia would not have invaded Ukraine had all of these events in the past 30 years not happened. But now we're in the conflict. They did invade. They did invade. We both agree that it's unjustified. Even before the invasion, the United States has scuttled every attempt at negotiation. Even within days after Russia invaded, there were still talks happening between Zelensky and Putin trying to prevent this from escalating. And let me see, I'm trying to find my exact. Yeah, Putin was trying to negotiate the end of the war. Zelensky even admits that the U.S. is refusing to negotiate. They're refusing to give Zelensky, because we've sanctioned Russia. Zelensky could argue, hey, if you stop this part of the invasion, if you only take this area, whatever, if we come to some type of ceasefire, I'm going to convince NATO and all the EU and the U.S. to get rid of these sanctions. Zelensky even said that the U.S. is refusing to lift sanctions or allow him to use sanctions as a negotiating tool.
Which interview was that discussion in?
Huh?
Which interview was that discussion in? Like, when did he say that? Because I don't have that.
Right at the beginning of the war.
Right at the beginning of the war? Okay, yeah. I'd have to look into the exact quote, and if you can send it in the private chat, and then maybe I'll write up something to address it. Because if I don't know something, I
don't have it right here in the private chat, but I can send it to you afterwards and make sure it's in the description.
Perfect. I'll comment on that when I take a look at that, because I don't want to. There's a lot of like intentional propagandizing about this on both sides, unfortunately, and I just don't want to. Like, if I don't know something, I don't know. I wish more people would say that in these discussions. That's a certain someone we know does not do that as often as he should. But from my perspective, I think would the United States take advantage? Yeah, to some extent, true, probably. But I would also point out, like, this was an invasion. These forces were organizing along the border, and they were openly saying, "We're not going to invade. We're not going to invade." And then they invaded. So I gotta have to.
Organizing along the border in response to what?
To which part? The 2014 or
why was Russia organizing along the border? What was that in response to?
It was an invasion plan. What do you mean in response to?
It was in response to us continuously sending them weapons and then sanctioning them and continuing to escalate.
Then why did they
saw them getting up and then we ran and said, okay, hey, let's sit down and have talks. There were talks in the way. There were talks going on in Turkey that could have. We'll never know. Maybe it wouldn't have resolved it. But the thing is that our policy in this conflict has been to avoid negotiations at almost all costs.
First off, I gotta say, like, the idea that Russia was negotiating in good faith, I'm heavily skeptical of that, because again, they were also saying things like, "Oh, we're denazifying Ukraine." That was a BS narrative from the very beginning, because they have their, and you said it yourself, like earlier, that this idea that Russia was seriously interested in denazification is absurd. And again, like, you can have a concern about an expansion of an alliance without having to annex territory that retroactively justifies that alliance. This is where I think we're kind of going back and forth at this point on the whether or not it's rational. I'm under the position that I don't trust Russia to engage in good faith, especially with the Ukrainians. I'm not under any delusion that the United States is taking advantage of the situation. It's a major military power, the most powerful nation on the face of the earth, bar none. But I would also point out that part of the reason that there is this antagonism is partially because Russia does not state its intentions with any honesty. I mean, these are the same guys who were actively denying that they were interfering in a misinformation campaign in 2016, spreading medical misinformation in 2020. I mean, this is the thing. Part of the problem.
Wait, are you a Russiagator?
I don't believe they stole the election, but they definitely interfered.
You
but they're not the only ones.
Do you think they had a significant influence?
it'd be hard to quantify significant, but like, yeah, to some extent. I mean, think about all the conspiracy theories that we've seen spread around. It doesn't take a lot to spread a lie, or to spread a crap ton of lies. I mean, you just get a couple people in a basement and you target a large, specific hot button issue and just repeat a lie over and over again. It spreads like wildfire. So it's kind of hard to quantify whether or not that changed the election result. But my point is that they tried, and that's where it's like this continued view of Russia just coming to the table and wanting to negotiate comes in. It goes against the hostile and bad faith behavior that we have consistently seen. And so I as much as I don't want to be like, hey, we should trust Uncle Sam. No, we should question all governments, but we can't just be like, hey, let's rationalize Russia's stated concerns when in many cases they've kind of just bullcrapped their way through discussions before. I mean, Russia straight up denied that they had troops in Crimea in 2014. They were like, "What troops? What are these?" And then it's like, "Oh, wait, they're all Russian equipment." Like that's the kind of issue I think that keeps going back. We're having this conversation in the context of are they interacting in good faith? Is America acting in good faith? And it hasn't come up enough that Russia repeatedly lies about its intentions to Ukraine, to its neighbors, to the United States, and that's partially because it's a dictatorship.
And I don't deny any of that. I see, however, my problem is that you're not seeming to give the appropriate weight to how much the U.S. lies when it is literally the global hegemon right now. It is so much more powerful in every possible way than Russia is, and so its influence and its lies are going to have so much more impact than Russia. I think Russia tried for 30 years to try and come to some type of better relationship with us. And I think Putin felt like he was being lied to for 30 years. That's not me justifying. I have no love for Putin. I have no love for his regime or the Russian government or anything like that. I just see that's probably what his perception is. And I think that's what it is. But I want to move on a little bit. I want to ask just a couple.
I really enjoyed this. We should do this again. This has been really fun.
Yeah. Who do you think blew up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline?
I don't know. I mean, the U.S. has a vested interest in that, but I've seen so much back and forth on it, and I don't think I'm qualified to give an opinion on that.
Have you read Seymour Hersh's reporting on it?
I
where
did
he
a couple
accuses?
A while back, but I don't remember a lot of it, just because I was heavily focused. This is the one downside of my channel. When I was going for my master's, I was heavily focused on like American domestic politics,
Hey,
and so
happens,
there's limitations. It's like this. I had these things where I'm like, "Do you hear about that?" I was like, "Oh, great, one more thing I got to read about." It's and yeah. So I don't remember the specifics of that. But if you want to resend it to me, I can go back over it.
Well, I can just describe it real quick. I mean, Seymour Hersh, he had a confidential informant, which you should always be somewhat skeptical, but he has a very good history with confidential informant of people that were in the room where the Biden administration explicitly made a plan to do a deep sea dive and blow up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. He was able to name the military bases where such training would be possible. He was pointing out that really there's only a couple countries that even would have the ability to perform such an operation, the US being one. And we also have on February 7th, 2022, a couple weeks before the invasion, Biden explicitly said if Russia invades, then there will be no longer Nord Stream 2. We will bring an end to it. I promise you we will be able to do it. So
yeah,
I do firmly believe that we blew up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which caused one of the worst environmental disasters probably in recent history, because it's just methane that's just going straight up into the atmosphere. And so me as a progressive, as somebody that's more on the left, that is not valuable to me to do that, even if it's to maybe protect Ukraine. I don't see how that's protecting Ukraine either.
I wouldn't even say like that would be protecting Ukraine. I think that would just be pretty stupid. But I from what I've and I
To
again
me, it's part of this larger policy of how we're interacting with Russia. and how we've been
I
doing it for decades.
I'd have to look at the details of that a little more. I'm based off what you've described. That sounds like a completely unjustified act of aggression, but I'm not going to like say, hey, yeah, that's absolutely what we did, because unless I understand the context of a quote, I'm just not going to use it. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
if I don't understand what Biden meant, and this is the other thing. We're two guys who, we engage in journalism, we engage in politics, we engage in this stuff, and we do as much research as we can with the time we've had. And part of the reason we had this scheduling issue was me working two different jobs and then also looking for a full time. But we're only responding to the amount of information that is available to us. And the unfortunate thing in a lot of these conversations is we don't really get a lot of access to the information from the people within until decades later because it gets declassified. So is it possible that is there a vested interest maybe in destroying the pipeline? Yeah, sure. I wouldn't be surprised if there was some consideration to doing that or doing it. But unless I see like, hey, this is definitively the United States that did it, I'm just going to say I don't know. And I do, and I'm glad I got to come on just to make this specific point. I think when regardless of like whoever's watching this after the fact, whoever you side with on this issue, please don't be afraid to say I don't know. There's a lot
Oh yeah,
of
absolutely.
bad information, and I really wanted to say this over and over again. There is virtue in saying I don't know.
Oh yeah, and
So
there's also a virtue in acknowledging that both sides have propaganda, and you should not take both sides at
yes,
their word. Same thing in the Israel-Palestine thing. I don't trust Hamas. I don't trust Israel.
I
Like propaganda is a weapon of war, and it is a very deadly weapon of war. And I 100% agree. And as somebody that is I try and be very scientific minded, and I believe in things like falsificationism, which I've done videos about on my philosophy YouTube channel that people can check out if they want. I want to see as much evidence as possible, and you want to know what? I like to learn new things. So if somebody can prove me wrong, then good, because I like learning new things. Um, I only have a couple more questions about this specific issue because I think we're kind of reaching the end point. What do you think success in Ukraine looks like to you? Like what do you see
uh,
the end point of this being?
so as far as being able to effectively have a perfect end to a war, there's no such thing. But I would say some sort of obviously I don't think Ukraine is going to get Crimea back as much as I think they would have a legal right to retain their territory. I think the bigger thing here is Russia's forces withdraw with no intention to continue its attack. A peace treaty is set up that guarantees
Withdraw
that you
from the. I just want to be clear. Withdraw from the 4 oblasts that it currently has control over.
yes, and a peacekeeping
The Donetsk,
force.
the Luhansk, the Donbass. Withdraw
Yes,
from all of that.
yes,
Okay.
and then have a neutral peacekeeping force there and let the people vote on their own. I like if the people like this is the thing. If the people say, "Hey guys, we would like it to be more autonomous. We the government in Kiev was corrupt. They didn't listen to us, and they can do that under their own free will without Russian or Ukrainian military personnel harassing them one way or the other." Fine, that I think that's a pretty fair thing to handle. Whether or not it's legal under international law, I would that has to be decided. But so long as Russia is able to continue to build a foothold for further encroachments, I don't think we're going to see a situation where people take any peace negotiations seriously just because of how many people have lost their lives. And it's one of the horrible things about this because like if you were to say to me like if 2022 didn't happen and we were just talking about what happened in 2014 like and the ongoing ethnic conflicts there, I'd be more inclined to agree with you on the NATO stuff. But I think with how many people were the decline in overall violence, the open questions about NATO, like its existence, I think the 2022 thing makes it a lot harder for me to swallow that because there's something that I think is kind of pernicious in the way they think about the people that they're surrounded by. But back to your question. Sorry, I ramble again. I ramble.
Yeah.
It
So I mean, you continue to support us sending military aid to Ukraine,
yes,
correct?
yes.
And you, I'm assuming you believe that because eventually that will allow
Ukraine to
You
get a
believe
strong
it'll allow
foothold.
Ukraine to be in a position to take back those 4 oblasts?
Well, not necessarily to take back those 4 oblasts, because I said I don't think they're taking Crimea, and I don't think they're taking those back. I think
Well,
Russia.
Crimea is not one of the oblasts that I'm talking
No,
about.
I know. I mentioned Crimea, and I'm just clarifying.
Okay. All right.
I doubt, with how inconsistent aid has been militarily, that they're going to take those back. What I am saying is they should be militarily in a strong enough position to prevent further encroachments, and then a peace deal coming to fruition, and then in which Russia agrees to withdraw, hopefully. But that, again, we really, it's going to be very difficult. And some United Nations peacekeeping force allows for a sort of neutral zone until like they can figure it out. Because again, like this is the thing I want to keep emphasizing. The people who live there should be able to decide their fate, not the United States, not Russia, the people who live there, and they should be able to do so in peace. And so like it's a rough. I know it's a rough
Right
hodgepodge.
now, the United States is one of the main ones telling you what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do.
But that also means like part of the thing in the case of the Ukrainian government.
Since
But
2014, they said,
even
no,
like
you're
even
not
in like
allowed to. You're not allowed to pick this Democratic. We don't like this Democratic guy. You need to pick a different guy. Oh, you're not allowed to engage in these negotiations, and you're not allowed to say, "Hey, we're gonna." The U.S. will agree to lift sanctions if you agree to these settlements, even if you lose some territory, because Russia has about 23% of Ukrainian territory right now,
yeah.
where they basically have complete control over.
But I would
So
also say
we
on
are
the
there right
inverse
now saying, no, you don't get to decide this, Ukraine. We're going to decide for you, and we're going to keep pushing this in a very specific direction, no matter how many Ukrainians die.
No, I'm okay, but like again, even when we were openly hearing people talk of like withdrawing aid, the Ukrainian government has repeatedly made clear that they will continue to defend themselves to the best of their ability. If they won't, they don't
Everyone's
go to the
going to
United
say
States.
that. Everyone's going to say that. I'm not disagreeing that they're not going to say that, but they are far more likely. I believe, and I believe this based on listening to John Mearsheimer, among other people, that this is
I
a
have a
war of
friend who is
attrition.
very upset. I have a friend who is very frustrated with him.
Well, he can be frustrated all he wants. John Mearsheimer has a good record of being right on a lot of these issues, including on Ukraine not getting rid of its nuclear weapons. I think it doesn't matter how many weapons we give them. This is going to be a war of attrition, and Russia will be able to replenish its people more than Ukraine will. Ukraine is forcibly conscripting people, forcibly conscripting disabled people, people in their 40s and 50s. The Ukrainian men are trying to flee the country because they don't see any hope in this. So I don't see us being able to give them any amount of weapons that's going to change this situation. And to me, the only way this is going to change is if we finally agree to some type of negotiated settlement, even if we don't always get what we want, even if Russia ends up being able to keep some territory or whatever.
But again, like I think that well, first off, Russia is also like conscripting people from prisons, so it's not like they're in a good position either. This
They
war
have
of attrition
150
doesn't just
million people in their population. Ukraine has
yeah
37 million.
yeah. But again, that doesn't mean it's going to be, and all of them are fit for military service either. So obviously Russia has an advantage just because of its size. But again, like what happened? Let's say we do give Russia its territory. Let's say it decides it gets to keep all this territory, and we decide, you know what, we're going to pull back all of our aid. What prevents this from happening again? Like that's the big thing that keeps coming up. How do you prevent further staging grounds for other military conflict? This is why, and we're going back and forth on this, and I don't want to hash this out because we've been going for about an hour and a half. But that's the scary thing for me. I would love to be able to just say,
I don't
I
believe
just want to
Russia's
finish this real
goal.
quick.
Okay, I apologize.
Yeah, no, you're good. You're good. It happens with these kinds of things. It's fine. But I think like this this concern will remain unless there's some sort of guarantee. And I cannot help but feel like the discussion around ending the war heavily focuses on U.S. influence and not the end result on, and we're kind of repeating each other at this point a little bit. But like the the end result of what Russia might do to Ukraine again. I mean, they did it in 2014. They invaded. They lied that they weren't engaging here, and then they did it again in 2022. We can argue back and forth about whatever reasons they may have, but they're still lying and still engaging in military action. So unless there's something to stop them or something to guarantee that they don't continue, that's going to remain a concern for Ukraine, and they're going to ramp up their military as best they can to deal with that. And we're going to be back here again. And I just don't see an environment where this doesn't result in another war without some sort of guarantee stopping Russia.
I mean, looking at the facts on the ground and the way how Russia is economically and militarily, I do not actually believe that they have the ability to conquer all of Ukraine, let alone occupy all of Ukraine. I think that they wanted to take over these Russian parts, and I think that would end up being the buffer zone. I also do not believe that Russia is going to start attacking further into Europe, because that's automatically Article 5, and it's automatically a nuclear holocaust. I like Putin is not that irrational. And so I see some of those fears as just like they're going to take over Ukraine and then they're going to use that to take over the rest of Europe. I just see that as ludicrous.
I didn't say the attack in Europe. I'd say I'm specifically referring to Ukraine, like Russia taking more and more territory, building up and over time.
I understand, and I'm not necessarily saying that this is your position, but many of the people that do support your position, kind of generally, as far as us helping Ukraine. I mean, I was talking to my father the other day, who's not a political guy in the way that you and I are, but he was convinced that they're just going to run roughshod and take over all of Europe, and I just think that's just nonsense. They don't have the capability to do that.
I mean, I don't think they're going to run through all of Europe or anything like that. But I didn't initially think they were going to invade either. And I mean, they did try to take the capital in Ukraine. They tried to assassinate Zelensky. I mean, so like there is this thing where I'm like,
something that happens during war. I mean, that's. I think they were more interested in like destroying the capital than necessarily taking it. I don't think they would have been able. I mean, they weren't. They were not able to occupy the capital. They were not able to take it and hold it.
But I would distinguish here like what we think they're capable of and what they think they're capable of. And I am very hesitant to say, oh yeah, they'll definitely not try to take further Ukrainian territory. I thought they were going to just do their military exercises and go home. And we're here having this conversation 2 years later. Come February, we'll be probably having this conversation on the third anniversary. I mean, that's where it's like I don't want to be like, oh, this will absolutely happen. But I after everything that I've seen and after just how much like they're never gonna do this, and then they actually crossed the line and did this, I'm very worried that we could potentially ignore the situation getting worse. But that's as far as I can go on that. But
I only have two more short questions
yes.
about this, and then we can move on to other stuff if you want.
Sure.
What do you think we would or should do if Russia nuked Ukraine in some way? If they dropped a nuclear weapon?
Jesus Christ.
On Ukraine?
I don't even think there's anything that can be done at that point. Like, I mean, like the Budapest Memorandum does provide a mechanism for assistance and support, but it's pretty vague.
Okay, but these international agreements don't mean anything in this conflict.
No, I'm just using this as a frame of reference here, not saying that that's an obligation, because I don't think we ratified the Budapest Memorandum. We did ratify the NATO Charter, so we're not legally obligated to uphold this. Little different. That's also part of the reason the whole James Baker thing went to hell. There was no ratified treaty, so that's got to be a fun little thing for everybody in the having this conversation, having to go through the Constitution and the international sign. Honestly, I have no idea. There's no. If it's gotten to the point where Russia uses nuclear weapons, I think we're already dead. I don't want to be like extreme there, but I just don't. Once the nukes are out, you can't put them back. That's the thing. I think it would escalate to a point where it's like completely and utterly insane. And so I firmly believe like there's still, even throughout this war, there needs to be consistent back and forth communication behind closed doors or in whatever mechanisms they need to do to make clear there will be no nukes used here, regardless of where this conflict goes. We cannot let it get to that point. So if we get to that point, we've lost. That's just my answer. Like we've all lost if we get to that point. Nobody. I think the best thing you could do is probably like provide some humanitarian aid, help refugees, medical aid. I don't know. I really hope it never
That
comes
right
to that.
there, providing humanitarian aid. I did want to circle back because we didn't get to this. I wanted you, because you've looked into this, break down the U.S. aid to Ukraine for me.
So yes, I have this right up here. So I'm not doing this off of memory completely because so right now, since the invasion in 2022, because the first bill was March 2022, 13.6 billion, relatively small amount. And then there was another bill in May of that year and September of that year. That was 40.9 billion. And then there was a December bill, 47.4, and then another 61.3 billion. That's just the ones that are appropriated by Congress. There's discretionary stuff that goes in there. But as of the invasion in February, we have spent roughly 106 or sent 106 billion, but we have spent 175. So the spending in this case is not necessarily like everything that's being sent to Ukraine. It's also like what we're doing to replace the weapons that we send to them, or the equipment, or the emergency kits, or any sort of equipment and things like that.
Okay, so this is, and I don't mean to interrupt, but I
You're
want to
good.
nail down this part because I was reading this and I didn't understand that distinction between the 175 and the 106. So I'm glad you brought this up because that helps me understand. This is an argument that I've heard from people that support Ukraine, that if we're sending them weapons that, a lot of people don't realize, these missiles have to be rebuilt, or they have to be worked on, otherwise they become useless. If we do that, if we give them the weapons, then we can get new weapons for ourselves. That's what you're talking about with this difference.
Yeah,
right?
that's how they're doing the program. I don't
Yeah.
necessarily think that's an argument for or against it. I think that's just kind of the inevitable result of a
I've seen
military
people make
industrial completion.
I've
I'm
seen
sorry.
people make that. I've seen people make that
Yeah,
argument. So I'm
that
not
seems a
saying
little crass.
yeah, they're saying, hey, this is a great idea because it helps us so that we're not wasting the weapons. And I obviously you're saying that you don't have that belief. I just want to make it clear to the people that are watching about my belief. That is not valuable to me as
Yeah.
somebody that would be more than happy to half our military budget. Restockpiling the excessive amount of weapons we have is not valuable to me.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to make that point. But so there's 106 billion that we've sent directly to the Ukrainian government. Break that down for us if you can.
Yes. So the top one, top one just in terms of where it is on the graph that I'm looking at right now. 2.8 billion is in humanitarian aid. I think you and I both would agree that should be much higher as a percentage. Just the amount of human suffering and lives lost, the risk for infectious disease to spread when infrastructure is destroyed, water supply. I think there needs to be more humanitarian aid. Just if even if we're disagreeing on the military aid side of things, I think we can both agree that Ukrainian civilians need help. But to the rest of it, the budget is budget support. So this is specifically things that are involving like helping maintain the government, make sure they're able to keep, because the revenues
Pensions,
are going to,
paying bureaucrats, stuff like that.
and that's like a critical component of any effort to keep a country stable, and that's
Which I
about
also
33
don't have a problem with. I don't have a
Yes.
problem with money going to that.
Yeah, so the 33.3 billion roughly, and then weapons, equipment, and other military support. So this is provided through the Ukraine's Security Assistance Initiative, and also the Presidential Drawdown Authority and Foreign Military Finance Program. This is the area we've been arguing about. It's 69.8 billion. I will point out that
69 or 66.8 billion.
69. I misspoke.
Okay,
and I might have put a typo.
I have your article. I'm reading it right now. It says 66.8 billion.
Yeah, there was an error on that. That's a typo.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a typo. It's 69.8, and I was like really tired last night. So,
it happens, man.
the amount of times like that has happened, it's just like, oh my god, I reread that 3 times. But no, so like in terms of the overall, yeah, so that's where it is, and then you can click. I think it's citation 19. Here, let me make sure I have it right here. Yes, citation 19. You can pull the It's the oh no, that's the USA Facts one. I think.
Well, this is kind of the part that I wanted to get to, and I'm glad you broke this all down, because you say right here, for context, the total spent on Social Security in 2023 was an estimated 1.35 trillion, more than 8 times the value of the entirety of our aid to Ukraine. And you go on to say, providing aid to Ukraine doesn't prevent us from taking care of our citizens. A lack of political will does. And my response to this is, which one is a better investment for our citizens? 1.35 trillion Social Security has enormously
benefits.
huge benefits for us, and it's actually an investment. I don't see military aid or military spending really in general as having that same level of investment. So if that 100 and let's just say it's 106 billion, let's just say the 69.8 billion in military aid was instead going to our citizens, the investment benefit would be exponentially higher than it is right now going to Ukraine. You drop a bomb and that money's gone. You give it to people here who need that money, and then they reinvest it in the economy.
So
this is kind of why I wanted to go over this part.
So this is the part where the reason why I think people when I emphasize the military aid as distinct from the financial aid, because a lot, and this is where I kind of at the bottom I take a dig at Vivek Ramaswamy because I cannot stand him. Some people are under the apprehension that like the perspective that like, oh, it's just money we're giving and then they buy the military equipment. It's like a lot of this is old equipment we already have. So this is the value of that equipment in a lot of cases. In some cases, we are purchasing the equipment and then sending the equipment to them. But the main financial stuff, that's in the other stuff I described earlier. That's in the supporting budgets. That is in supporting, humanitarian aid. That's the stuff where we're doing like direct payments through our system. So that's
what I was talking about earlier, and you have it right here. Especially old military equipment doesn't provide for our citizens. Replacing it with new ones also doesn't provide for our citizens.
The point I'm making there is
the argument right there that's being made.
No, I'm specifically saying in that context, we're not sending. You can't cure homelessness or improve Social Security and Medicare with HIMARS. That's what I meant in that sentence. So that's the point I'm trying to make here. Is it's not that like this doesn't protect our citizens. And again, the nuclear proliferation issue is, in my opinion, a direct benefit, a direct issue that we are trying to prevent with this aid. The big thing for me is when we say, hey. And this is where, again, I'm taking a dig at Republicans. They seem to be operating under this approach that we are either for military aid or we are for supporting our people here. We have the means to do both. We are one of the strongest economies on the face of the earth. And I do not for 1 second believe that we couldn't increase Social Security support by just going after the wealthy with progressive taxes, or going after their investments in capital gains, or closing loopholes and properly funding the IRS. There are ways for us to take care of our citizens. And this was not so much an attack on your position as it was on isolationist Republicans who seem to be under the impression that, oh, if we could have all these benefits, or we could take care of our citizens if we just didn't send this damn money to Ukraine. And then if we stop sending money to Ukraine, they still wouldn't take care of us. So that's the point I'm trying to make here is you and I would love to see increases in public services, mental health, the taking care of the disabled, the elderly, the sick. I'd be thrilled if we could just get an increase in access to affordable health care and just have more Americans have access to it, if not get to universal health care at all. But I don't think our involvement in Ukraine is the thing that stops that. Republican conservative lobbyists and corporate Democrats are the ones who stop it. So that's the distinction I make here.
And here's where I'm going to disagree. And I'm glad you brought this up, because a lot of people would consider my position isolationist. I actually don't consider myself an isolationist. I just really want to reorient a lot of our foreign policy in general. But that's a completely bigger question. But as long as we have a war economy, not a defense economy, as long as we have a war economy that is explicitly being used to go to Ukraine and Israel, we just let Saudi Arabia buy $1 billion worth of weapons. As long as that war economy is up and functioning, the incentives are always going to be more towards these type of military interventions, and it's going to become more politically difficult to have the things that you and I want for our people.
I
That's my
think
position.
I don't necessarily disagree with that. The thing is, in this, I think Ukraine is unique because, like, it's very clear in the case of, you know, sending weapons to Saudi Arabia. That's clearly a profit-based decision. Like,
And just to be
only
clear, we're
profit.
selling them. We're not giving them weapons. I just want
Yeah,
to be
we're
clear.
selling them. Well, yeah,
Yeah.
selling them. That's what I meant. In that case, yeah, like, why the hell are we selling weapons to Saudi Arabia? Like, why are we? First off, we shouldn't be really working with them at all, just because of their atrocious
Because
human
we have a
rights
war
abuses.
economy.
Yes,
Because we have
and
a
well,
war
I know,
economy.
but
That's
you
why.
were agreeing on that. But I think in the case of Ukraine, we point to Ukraine as the biggest example, and not all the other more blatant failures where we have Saudi Arabia, as you mentioned, with the interventions in Libya. In those cases, I would say yes, that is an example of the war economy taking away from our citizens. But in the case of Ukraine, the risk to the global stability of just global stability in general is such a threat to our citizens that it merits this response. And I know we've been going a long time on this, and I really like this, but I cannot emphasize this enough. Just because something is happening halfway across the world does not mean it doesn't affect us. And that's where I look at this and I say,
and you and I are actually in agreement. You and I are actually in agreement. I just believe us being involved in this has negative effects on us.
And we're gonna keep going back and forth
fine.
disagreeing.
That's
And that's
fine.
fine. And I love
agree to
this debate. This is
disagree.
good.
I mean, I think you know, and people can rewatch this and think. I think I've made a somewhat decent case of why I don't believe that our involvement in this over the last several decades is progressive or is valuable to me as a progressive, as somebody that you and I'll just say conservatively, which is one of the few times I'm ever going to be conservative. We probably have like 60, 2/3 of the same view, if not higher.
Yeah,
I just
definitely.
don't see this as one of them, and I see it as a direct impediment to the bigger issues that you and I support: universal health care, all these other things.
And if you would ask me like 4 years ago, like, would I support sending weapons to a foreign country in a war? I'd probably say no. But I think the thing that I've become increasingly more cynical about is the cost of not helping countries defend their like ability to like maintain human rights. Because like I said before earlier that I couldn't eat or sleep for 3 straight days because of some of the horrible things that I was seeing when I started reporting on the issue. And it's very hard for me not to look at those things and say to those people who were, you know, killed in Bucha and Izium and other areas, and just say, you know, what's progressive about leaving these people behind? And that's the and again, like, I'm not saying that that's your intention.
and my instinctive response is going to be why this conflict and not half of the other horrible conflicts that are going on in the world.
Yeah. It's just going to go back and forth on that. But, you know, I do want to thank you for this conversation. This is actually, I think, my first debate since like high school. Yeah, I'm not even kidding. It has been years since I've done like a one-on-one scheduled debate, but this was
the
fun.
whole point was to learn and build with each other.
Absolutely.